And as we move on, we jump into the next category, non-fiction category. So may I have Manoj Mitta sir and Anu Majumdar on stage, please. So to give you a short bio, Manoj Mitta, an award-winning author, recently published Caste Pride, Battles for Equality in Hindu India. His earlier books address impunity of mass violence. When a Tree Shook Delhi, co-authored with H.S. Fulka on the 1984 anti-Sikh carnage and the fiction of fact-finding on Gujarat 2002. Initially focused on Dalit massacre post-1950, Caste Pride expands to explore caste through 2 centuries of legislative and judicial records. The book won the Value of Words Book Award 2024, complementing a hat trick with earlier honors of Ata Galata and Kalinga Literary Festival. A law graduate, Mita is a Delhi-based journalist. Thank you, sir. Thanks for being on stage. And our moderator, Anu Majumdar. Anu Majumdar has lived in Auroville for over 40 years. She was a dance choreographer with Auroville Dance Lab when she began to write poetry to structure works like Crossroad and Images for Present. Her books include Parallel Journey, Refugees from Paradise, and God Enchanters. She was poetry columnist with Art Illustrated, and poetry has been variously antagonized, most recently in Converse. She is the coordinator of Auroville Literature Festival. Thanks for being here, ma'am, and over to you.
So good to see everybody here, and I'm very happy to be able to moderate this session with this fabulous book. Actually, let me just hold it up for a second.
Thank you.
So this is the book Caste Pride, and I really recommend it to all of you. If you just look at this cover, it speaks volumes. You have the staircase going up, you see this caste Brahmin person going inside a temple, and you see this dark figure at the bottom with a broom who is faceless. You don't know who she is or who he is even. So that spells out what this book is trying to cover. The complete title is Caste Pride, Battles for Equality in Hindu India. So I'm going to actually, this is the result of doom scrolling, as you said. So, all right. So this book is an extraordinary piece of research. It's detailed, it's rigorous, it's exhaustive, and it spans the pre-colonial era, our attitudes of that time, the colonial phase, and the post-colonial, and where we are, and to see where we've come so far and where it still needs to go. And, it also kind of puts in our face things we have now begun to take for granted, things we deny. It's all over everyday newspapers, but there are things we sometimes just refuse to see. So I'll just start with a very small personal anecdote. When I got this book, it went back to the time I was about 8 years old. There used to be a maid servant who used to come and help my mother, and she used to bring her daughter on school holidays. And I used to play with her. She was 2 years older than me. She was a very bright kid. And we used to play in the garden, play in the room, and it was fine with my parents. Until one day, my grand aunt showed up. And when she saw us playing together, there was like a shock tantrum running through the house, and my mother was castigated. And the maidservant immediately pulled this child out, and the daughter never came back with her again. So at that age, it was like I had lost a friend, and then I forgot about it, and then it was normalized. And this is something which the book also covers in much greater detail. That's a very, very tiny image of what this book covers. And also the state of continued, I would say, denial. So, Manoj, you're this journalist from Delhi, as we say, and you have consistently focused on law, human rights, and social justice. So, to dive into the book, it starts with about 9 pages which document the legal milestones of the battle against caste, which is very telling because you see one step being taken forward and 3 steps backwards because somebody has intervened, some objection has been there, and then another courageous step forward until the laws get passed. Now, just tell me before we go further, what brought you to this topic?
Oh yeah, I don't need a mic. Uh, Let me begin by saying how happy I am to be here. And this is not by way of a formality. This is not something I would say everywhere. Madras means a lot to this research because what came as an eye-opener to me was that a lot of these battles for equality in Hindu India, um, I mean, not many people here may be aware of it. A lot of these battles were fought here in Madras Presidency. Uh, I may, just to put it in context, remind you of what happened when somebody as well known as Swami Vivekananda set out on his Bharat Yatra in the last decade of the 19th century. When he reached down south, specifically the Malabar region, which was part of, by the way, the Madras Presidency, though it is technically Kerala, when he reached that place, what he saw there shocked him so much that he called that whole area, a lunatic asylum. Were you aware of this? This is a very well documented fact. He called it a lunatic asylum because of the nature and degree of untouchability he saw in South India. This might come as a shock. This is very counterintuitive because we are having this dialogue at a time when when we hear reports about this threat of delimitation, the politics of it. South India has developed so much and it is being penalized for controlling family planning. There's a threat of South Indian states, losing the number of seats in parliament, right? So we are all accustomed to seeing South as the more progressive, the more developed part of the country. But not too long ago, just about a century ago, it was just the opposite. Here was Vivekananda, who was traveling all the way from Bengal. He traversed north, middle India, and he comes to south. And what he sees here, what he was referring to is the fact that if there was untouchability was of course not limited to the south. What was different about the untouchability practiced in the south was if the rest of the country had untouchability, what South India, what Madras Presidency and what the two princely states of Kerala, Cochin and Travancore had was unapproachability. It meant that, just the fact that you are there in my presence, even if it is at a great distance, you are nowhere near touching me physically, but just the fact that you are somewhere in the proximity. And in the case of Travancore, they went to the extent of prescribing the distance. If you are an Nambudripad and the other one is an Erava, not necessarily an untouchable as we understand it, not necessarily a Pulaya who's a Dalit in today's terms, right? So you have to maintain this much distance. And if you are a Nair and an Erava, the distance could be lesser because Nair is not as pure, in caste terms as Nambudri. So these are the kind of things he saw. So this was our starting point. And because the caste prejudice and its most extreme manifestation, namely untouchability, was in this, the most egregious form, as I said, it was called unapproachability. And in some cases, it was called unseeability. Just your very sight, no matter how far you are, just your very sight is polluting to me, inauspicious to me. I will have to go and do all sorts of rituals to get over the effect of the bad luck that you would bring or the contamination you would bring. So these notions were so deeply entrenched in the South that some of the greatest battles against caste took place in the South. And earlier in the morning we heard Sainath. Now his latest book is called what? Unknown Heroes of India's Freedom Struggle. Now if I were to give it a different title, my book, I would call it Unknown Heroes of India's Equality Struggle. We are more accustomed to, talking about, reading about freedom fighters. Why? Because the villain in the freedom struggle is who? Is an outsider, the white man. So it is easier for us to dwell on that because it's no skin off our nose. It's not discomforting to demonize the white man, right? But when it comes to these equality battles, right? Who's the villain? It's somebody from within us, within our community, the elite of our community, the decision makers, the ones who we are accustomed to seeing as respected figures. So that is the discomfort. Now, the unknown heroes, since I'm in Madras, I'll focus on some of them from within this region. And not all are lower caste. Some of them are upper caste. And a lot of them, in fact, are upper caste. And I mention this because I want to dispel the notion that these battles were necessarily between lower caste and upper caste. On the contrary, they were largely between progressive, liberal Hindus and orthodox Hindus, traditionalists, or those who are capable of and who often cited scriptures in defense of very oppressive practices, right? So and that's what makes it difficult. The counterpart of caste, the Western counterpart of caste is what? Race. There's far greater acceptance of that problem, and that has to do with the fact that there is no religious dimension to race. And this is not something that I'm insisting. In these battles that I have described here, it is the proponents of caste or the status quo, they would say, how dare you want this practice to be changed? How dare you suggest that I should let that person come close to me, or he should be allowed to walk on the same street? This is contrary to certain things that were sanctioned by our scriptures. So, yeah. Sorry, I'm very sorry. I tend to get lost, and
You have a lot to say, but I'm just coming back to what you said, that the Madras province actually made huge leaps, and made that strugal to take certain, legislations through. But
and some of those unknown heroes were, again, very counterintuitive, were British rulers themselves.
Yeah, this is my question here, is that when the colonial, those administrators, when they came, they started overlooking whatever was happening in order to gain the acceptance of the privileged classes, let's say. And then they started putting out these very stringent, punishments. And then, because it was being done by the colonialists, suddenly it started being adopted by the upper class. So from there, how did the Bill of Untouchability get introduced? And how did that come through? If you could.
Again, this question is very integrally linked to Madras presidency. A while ago, we heard in the session on the music festival, we heard a reference to how these festivals began in 1928. Am I right? Just 2 years prior to that, in 1926, Madras presidency acquired the distinction of enacting the first ever law against untouchability. This is something that came as a revelation in my book. I'm no historian in the traditional sense. When you go to a library, I often consult the Nehru Memorial Library in Delhi. There are shelves and shelves devoted to caste. Now, what is different about this work, why it has been able to bring out so much new material despite so much work already being done on caste by a range of academics, is because wittingly or unwittingly, this turned out to be the first serious work on the intersection of law and caste. Some of this aspect, the legal aspects of caste, were missed out. As a result, something as significant as the first ever law against untouchability was missed out. And this is something that should have been not only known, but also should have been a great cause for celebration. Why do I say that? Because the legislator who was instrumental in getting this enacted, who drafted it and who mobilized support for it against all odds, was himself a Dalit. And no, I'm not talking about Ambedkar. It was not MC Raja either. I'm glad somebody mentioned that. MC Raja has the distinction of being the first Dalit legislator anywhere in the country. And this is courtesy of one British unknown hero, unsung hero. That is the governor of the time, Wellington, in 1919, before anybody from Indian community, not Congress, not even Justice Party, because Justice Party were talking about the intermediate caste, the Shudra caste. Now this man goes below them and he nominates the first ever Dalit as a legislator, and that is a revolution that never was noticed. What it meant was suddenly, here's a Dalit, I mean the term Dalit was not used, a Panchama, whose very presence, as I said, this is a place of unapproachability. So in an extreme form of untouchability he was a victim of, that man is now made to sit at the high table, and like everybody else, he is now addressed as Honorable Member MC Raja. Otherwise, his very presence is contaminating, but here, this was brought about by Wellington, and Raja was the great hero of that thing. Now, the one I'm talking about, because of the 1919 reforms, there were several very combative Dalit legislators like Raja who gained access to the legislature. And the most combative of them, the most heroic of them, was a man who went completely unknown, and that is R. Veerayan. There's so little literature available on him that after this came out in my book and there was some awareness about it, people were still wondering where he was from, to which particular community he belonged. Now what he did was, he tried to engage with and overcome this issue of unapproachability. So he wanted Dalits to be able to walk on the same streets. There was one big battle that took place in Kalpatti near Palghat, which, as I said, was part of Madras Presidency. So as a result of that, he took up that, and he himself was a victim of several such instances of untouchability. So he had that motivation, and he got that law passed, the first ever law against untouchability in 1926. And we still don't know enough about him because somehow this was overlooked. What we do know is that it was in the year 1937-38, a law was passed against untouchability by the Rajaji government. But that law was actually of a lesser order than the one that Veerayan was instrumental in enacting a decade earlier, 12 years earlier. How do I say that? Again, if you look at the fine print, the Veerayan law criminalizes untouchability and imposes a penalty. The Rajaji law, which we all celebrate as the first law in the textbooks, this is an example of history being written by victors. In our instance, history being written by the dominant castes or dominant sections. So Rajaji's book, Rajaji's law, all it does is it says that any custom that sanctions untouchability will not be recognized by the courts in this province. But if somebody is guilty of committing untouchability, what action will be taken against him? No, the bill is silent on it. It does not criminalize or penalize. It does not define offenses, nor does it prescribe penalties for those offenses. So it was a very hesitant, what she was talking about, one step forward, two steps backward. You know how insensitive this is, and you know how it is difficult to carry all sections with you. So you pretend to have done something, but in a very inoffensive way, in a manner that does not rock the boat too much. So these are the kind of things that happened. It took a lot of such, back and forth in the legislative efforts before we had a proper law. And even when it was finally passed, we still know, in theory, there are some very stringent laws. For instance, the 1989 Prevention of Atrocities Act, that's supposed to be so stringent that it is even considered draconian by some. But then, when these big atrocities take place, there's so little by way of justice. So my attempt was to understand why there is so much injustice, why there is so much of impunity, betrayed by some arm or the other of the Indian state. And that is what led me to this research of these. I mean, my research was all about the debates that took place in legislatures and courts. So there cannot be anything more authentic than that, in the sense that it's not some some letter to an editor, or it's not some entry in a diary. These are all things that were officially put there on record. The debates that when somebody wanted to legalize intercaste marriage. Why do I mention intercaste marriage? Because we all have a stake in that. It's not only about lower caste, right? You should see, I mean, the man who did that, again an unsung hero, was Patel, not Vallabhbhai Patel, but his elder brother Vithalbhai Patel.
Can I come in with a question here?
Yeah,
Because
sure.
That was also a very interesting point, because the amount of back and forth again, and the amount of excuses put forward to impede anything to go forward. If you could outline that, and also the fact that it took so long, and finally it was post-independence, then
Yeah.
when there was no choice left,
Yeah.
and no choice left to blame anybody else,
Yeah.
that it had to. But this is a problem which still exists. But if you would just go through that.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, what she said is right. It took a 32-year battle for that measure to be enacted. We are speaking in this era of Hindutva, about this consolidation of Hindus. So we take it for granted that anything that brings together Hindus, that sees them all through the prism of solidarity and fraternity, it's a no-brainer. Yes, why should we keep Hindus apart, you would say, in the context of today's debates. But not too long ago again, in 1918, when in that same spirit, Vithalbhai Patel introduced a bill, all it sought to do was that intercaste marriages are taking place despite all the restrictions imposed on them by our custom, by our scriptures. And it is wrong to treat these couples as though they are living in sin, and it is even worse to consider the offspring of those marriages to be illegitimate. It is time we did something about it. And you know what happened? The Hindu right of the time, and the Hindu right of the time, by that I don't necessarily mean RSS and its offspring, because RSS was yet to come into existence. That came into existence only in 25. The Hindu right then was, you had Vishwa Hindu, the Hindu Mahasabha, and a lot of it was within Congress itself. Congress was the big tent. So you had leaders like Madan Mohan Malviya, Surendranath Banerjee, who at different times were president of Congress party. They came out with very antagonistic statements. The pushback made by them was reminiscent of this Hindu khatre mein hai. They said, this is going to endanger our religion. This is not the way things are done. And there was much debate about, anuloma marriage, pratiloma marriage. I don't know if these terms mean anything. In fact, Smriti was saying that she had an intercaste marriage which was an anuloma marriage, because which is actually not considered as offensive by orthodox elements as pratiloma. Why is pratiloma worse? Pratiloma is where an upper caste woman marries a lower caste man. So that was absolutely no for them. And the offspring of those were declared by our law books, that is Manusmriti and all, as chandalas, who are unfit for human interaction. Yeah. And I may add that, the first such law that the British were also, trying all sorts of tricks. First, they attempted to win over the dominant sections of Hindu society by incorporating these features into their laws. So the first such attempt was made in 1795. This was just a year after Manusmriti was translated. In 1795, they came out with a law which said that Brahmins, under no circumstances, will be imposed a death sentence. This is an echo of, or this is drawing from the concept of Brahma Hatya. That even Lord Ram had to perform a penance for the sin of committing, for the sin of killing Ravan, who was a Brahmin, or at least half Brahmin. So so deep was that feeling. So that's why, they incorporated that, but then about 2 decades later, they rolled it back. So they had their own arc of learning and all that. So I traced all that through these debates that took place in legislatures and courts. So a lot of new material that's come out through this book in the process.
Okay, I think we are running a little short on time. So I still had a few questions, but I think it'll
I'm
be
sorry
if-
that I
No, no, no.
did
It'll
I
be
do
good
that?
to take audience questions at this point. Oh, look. Yes.
Sure.
Good morning. My name is Eda Patani. I'm from grade 11 from Sishao MR School. So you were talking about, and I'm very glad you brought that up, progressive and orthodox Hindus, right? So there's this book that I read, Hindus in Hindu Rashtra by Anand Ranganathan. I suggest this to everybody. It talks immensely about how Hindus are their own enemies, right? And in history, and being a Hindu and Kshatriya myself, I'm confused, or I dare say appalled at the amount of sort of inequality we've shown the other castes. So coming to my question, in present day, how exactly do we encourage middle ground between these castes? Because if you do, there's a sort of rampancy between these castes if you try to encourage such matters.
Okay. Did you actually say that you are a Kshatriya?
Yes.
Yes. so you are betraying what my title says, caste pride. Let me tell you, I'm glad you used that expression, because it's a perfect segue for me to say something about the controversy that took place about the coronation of Shivaji. Now, Shivaji is somebody who possibly ticks all the boxes. He was a great administrator, he was a great ruler, and he was a great strategist, great warrior. That's how he founded that empire, right? And it spread after his death across the country, even in, as somebody said, to Tamil Nadu, Tanjore, right? Though that was not directly by him, but it was by a half brother of his who came here. But they were all over the country, right? Now, in his time, when he escaped narrowly from, in very dramatic circumstances, from the clutches of Aurangzeb, he reaches his kingdom, and he comes back to his kingdom and tells his prime minister, Pingale, who's a Brahmin, and other Brahmins, I need very urgently to be coronated as an emperor, because that man said, I'm a bandit, that I'm a lawbreaker, that I have no business to come in the way of tax collection of his empire. So I need to be an emperor myself, to be treated as an equal. He was refusing to recognize my sovereignty. So he says, I need to be anointed as Chhatrapati. And do you know what happened? The Brahmins of his kingdom refused to do so. So he had to cut a long story short, he had to get a Brahmin all the way from Varanasi called Gagabhat, and it is said that he had to bribe him. And he comes down and he creates a fancy lineage for him. And he says, yes, it is true. They come up with one story, the Brahmins of the 19th century. This was there in a court judgment, in a privy court judgment. That's how this episode figures in my book, because I limit myself only to these legal documents. So there was this, the coronation controversy of the medieval age was actually cited in the 1857 judgment of the Privy Council. There, the Brahmins in the medieval ages onwards were saying, whatever was said in scriptures about fourfold Varna doesn't apply in Kali Yuga. In Kali Yuga, there are only two Varnas, Brahmins and Shudras. There are no Kshatriyas and Vaishyas. So, at a time when India was subject to invasions, the elite, the social elite of our country were saying that Indians had no tradition of, have any martial tradition. They are not capable of fighting against their enemies or protecting their borders. All we are capable of doing is, the bulk of the humanity in India are all Shudras, steeped in tamas, meant to do only servile work. This is the sum and substance of the position they took. And this is what they said to Shivaji, that you are just a Shudra and you have pretensions of being a a Kshatriya, so we refuse. So this man, in that context, creates a lineage for him and says, no, no, no. And the reason they give that for that is that Parashurama, according to them, had already exterminated all the Kshatriyas. So there are no Kshatriyas in Kali Yuga. That was the basis, the scriptural basis of the position they took. So this man says, no, some people survived, some Kshatriyas survived in Rajasthan, in Mewad area. So Shivaji was actually a Sisodia. He was not a Maratha. So this is the kind of concocted, genealogy they had to create for him to be conferred. And even then, after all that genealogy, it was left to Gaga Bhatt from Varanasi to confer that title on him. So what to talk about this? This term has become very famous now. We need intellectual Kshatriyas, they say. But you must first recognize these facts. These are all very incontrovertible, but very uncomfortable facts. There's a tendency on the part of the right wing, the nationalists, to overlook all this, to quote facts very selectively. These are all things that show that there's need for us to do a lot of introspection. I'm sorry to give such a long answer.
Okay.
One last question.
Yeah, you mentioned about the Madras Education Act by Rajaji in this book.
Yes.
How do you see the Prime Minister's Vishwakarma scheme now?
Very, very similar they are in spirit. I don't know how many of you know about this. In 1950s, there's only a passing reference to it in my book. There's this education scheme that Rajaji came up with, and that led to his downfall. He could never again come to power in Tamil Nadu after that. What was it about? It said that there's a brilliant book that came out a few years ago called Half a Day for Caste. That was actually the scheme of Rajaji's legislation, which said that you spend only half the day in the school, the other half you go back home and practice whatever is the traditional occupation of your family. So the Periyar and other self-respecters, as they were called, or Dravidian parties of the time, they were all up in arms and said this is bringing casteism through the back door, because it suits upper caste, the Brahmins, very well. They go back and say, okay, we chant our mantras, learn our mantras, and others are condemned to learn carpentry or weaving or be a barber. So this was something that led to such a controversy that he had to be replaced. Though he was the tallest Congress leader, he was replaced by Kamraj, and Kamraj had a long rule. Kamraj was from a lower caste. And so what this gentleman talks about, in spirit it is reminiscent of that when you are again saying, you go back to, take pride in whatever your traditional occupation was, it's all very problematic, Thank you.
One more question?
I promise to give a short answer.
Mike, yeah.
Scheduled castes and tribes. So, when the government or the general public of India, when they don't want untouchability or the caste system, why do they want, scheduled caste and scheduled tribe? Why are those seats reserved for some people? And why don't they get equal treatment, like the other people who are not part of the general, the scheduled castes and tribes?
Okay. So when I may tell you, it's a very huge issue. I don't deal with, by the way, there are 18 chapters in my book. I'm focusing on the intersection of law and caste, and what you talk about does fall within that rubric. But the volume of neglect of these aspects of the legal aspects is such that it is a 600-page book. There are so many themes that I could not deal with. So as of now, I am working on a sequel to this, and one of those themes is about this reservations, the issue of reservations. So I'll briefly explain. Mention that when this question of abolition of untouchability was taken up in the Constituent Assembly, it was this very question was raised: how can you, how can you deal only with the symptom that is untouchability and not say anything or not have any provision against the cause of that disease, that is caste. Now, so the consensus they arrived at was that in order to root out untouchability or to provide some beneficial measures, some helping hand, some affirmative action to lower castes, you need to recognize who they are. You can't overnight pretend that the problem has evaporated. So you need to know who those lower castes are, who need to be given that benefit. So we have to live with that very uncomfortable reality of having provisions only against the symptom and not the cause. That's the way it is.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for the thought-provoking discussion. And now may I request our MD, Dr. C. Chandramouli, to give the mementos.
So are you people having a good time? Yes. We started with very, very uncomfortable topics today to many of us, right? So we first traversed inequality, then we went on to gender, and now to caste. So this is what CIC does, provokes. So we are provoking distinct strands of thought. We are providing a platform for them to be voiced. And I'm sure the audience is picking up, the different thoughts that flow in and then taking away something that would stay with them as they go back and cogitate on what went on today. So with that, I have great pleasure in handing over these mementos to Mr. Manoj Mitta. Thanks for coming down.